I was reading on accessanallies.org a thread that talked about Japan and one guy that goes by the name of Kao. He advocated in the beginning that you should do a J1 attack, which means that Japan should attack on the first turn. They should just attack everybody they can. And he was ridiculed. Everybody before that figured that there's no way. I mean, you don't want the Americans to get their extra 20 IPCs, and you want to keep getting the 10 IPCs that you get for being at peace, and that's the way it should be, and nothing should ever change. And the Allies were winning more games than the Axis. The people thought that the game was tilted slightly towards the Allies. And then Kao comes along and he says, no, do a J1 attack everybody you can, just keep going, go as fast as you can, go as far as you can. And everybody, they just call him a heretic, and the world is not round, it's square, it's flat, and just reading through this, and people are just, another person to come in and they criticize him for it. He says, whatever, man, let's have a game.
In my playing experience, if a player has a strategy that sounds bizarre, that can be interesting, but a player that also issues an open challenge based on that strategy likely has something that's worth your attention. Hey Axis and Allies players, this is the Good Captain. Welcome to episode 3 in my Axis and Allies clinic, and what is also very likely going to be the only strategy video that I make on Global 1940 2nd edition. Before I get into the content of this video, let me provide some context. I am not a huge player of Global 1940 2nd edition. I think I played 5 to 10 games in the last 10 years or so. That was until last year when I decided to enter an online tournament that was being hosted through AAA. I really just like to play Axis and Allies, so I thought, yeah, why the heck not? I'll stack up some experience on this version and it'll be a lot of fun. Much to my surprise, here was the result. I went 9-0 against a group of folks that ranged in experience, while I had slim to no experience. Before starting the tournament, I decided that because I know almost nothing about Global 40, that I would go ahead and stick with the J1. I was going to take the Axis in every game until the Allies defeated that strategy. And I decided on that course of action because of the story that I just played for you from General Hand Grenade's video back in 2017. So to that end, I let the bid run as high as my opponent wanted it. Most of the bids ended up in the mid-20s. The highest bid I had was 29. The bid restrictions for this particular tournament were I'm just stating this to be thorough. It seemed that no matter what the bid placement was, it didn't matter at all. I took the Axis in every single game. I did the exact same strategy in every single game. So the purpose of this video is to publish the script that I used for Japan in particular. Germany was important, but it was Japan that was just the hammer that swept through the board and seemed unstoppable in each game. And one final disclaimer, the only reason I'm taking the time to explain all this stuff about the tournament is because I like to be as precise as I can when I'm discussing where I'm coming from. I like to resume myself. If you're a subscriber of this channel and you're watching my videos, you know this is something I like to do anytime I talk about strategy and tactics. This is not a victory lap. I'm not trying to brag. This J1 opener for Global 1940 2nd edition seems incredibly overpowered to me. So I'm now going to go ahead, turn the camera towards the board, and show you how to execute the J1. Japan's purchase on turn 1 is going to be 3 transports and save 5 IPCs. Okay, welcome to Global 1940 2nd edition, standard setup. 2 quick points of order before we get to pushing pieces. First, I had trouble getting everything in frame, so you can see the nose of the British battleship poking up into C-Zone 36. Of course, this battleship's in C-Zone 37. We will be attacking it, and we'll get to that in a moment. The other bit was that you can't see the Russian units north of Manchuria, and for this phase of this demonstration, it's not necessary. No matter what the Russians have done with those pieces, we're going to be executing the same combat move. So here we go. First up is 1 infantry out of Jehol, moving into Chahar. Next is 1 infantry from Shantung, moving to Anhui. Next, we're going to bring 1 artillery and 3 infantry from Kiangsi to Hunan. We're also going to bring 2 fighters and 2 tactical bombers from Manchuria to Hunan, and they can get away with this by moving along this flight path. 1, 2, 3. So let's go ahead and bring down the rest, and all these units will have 1 movement remaining. Next, we're going to bring 1 artillery and 3 infantry from Quangxi to Yunnan, and we'll support them with the tactical bomber and fighter from Kiangsu. So this also will be 1, 2, 3 with 1 movement point left over. Okay, we're going to deal with this British battleship now, and we're going to move 1 cruiser from Sea Zone 20 down to Sea Zone 37. We're also going to send both bombers from Japan down there as well. So just to keep this all in frame, I'm going to go ahead and sort of use French Indochina to represent this battle. And these bombers will move 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So they'll have 2 movement points left over for the non-combat movement phase. Next, we're going to move 1 infantry from Siam to French Indochina. Okay, now we're going to move to the Philippines. First, we're going to move a battleship, a destroyer, and 1 submarine from Sea Zone 19 to Sea Zone 35. Next, we're going to move a destroyer from Sea Zone 6 to Sea Zone 35. And finally, we're going to move 2 fighters and a tactical bomber from Japan to this sea zone. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4. And all of these units will also have 1 movement point left over. And now we're actually going to invade the Philippines. So first up, we're going to take the transport here in Sea Zone 19, load up the infantry and the artillery off of Manchuria, and head south. 1, 2, and offload. Next, we're going to load an infantry and an armor off of Japan onto this transport and bring it down to the Philippines to help with the invasion as well. All right, next, the fighter and the tactical bomber off of the carrier in Sea Zone 33 are going to go directly to the Philippines to support the invasion. So they'll come off the carrier for 1, 2, 3, and both of these units will have 1 movement point left as well. And the last thing to help out in the Philippines is going to be this fighter off of Formosa. We're going to go 1, 2, 3, so that now we have 2 fighters and a tactical bomber in both the sea zone and the Philippines themselves. There, I think that's a little bit more clear. Okay, we're almost done. 1 more to go, and that's the invasion of Quangtong. We're going to take this transport here in Sea Zone 20, come up, pick up 2 infantry off of Manchuria, come back down, and unload them into Quangtong. So it'll look like this. Come up, pull these 2 off, come back down, and offload. And the last major movement here is that all these remaining air units that can are going to dump into Quangtong. So this fighter off of Okinawa will go 1, 2, and 3. The tactical bomber off of Japan goes 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember, it has 5 because of the air base. And finally, the fighters and tactical bombers on the aircraft carriers will go 1, 2, 3. So when we're done, all the air units stacked up in Quangtong will also have 1 movement left over. Okay, well, that completes the combat move. There's a lot going on here. Let's break it down a little bit and see what's going on. So out of the gate, I just want to highlight that almost all of these battles are of no consequence. And I mean to say that there's something like a 99.5% chance or better that you win, with the possible exception of Yunnan and the attack against the British battleship in Sea Zone 37. Yunnan is a 91% chance of success. Even after you guarantee that you're going to retreat, if you're only down to your air units, there's still a 91% chance you're going to win this battle. And it's very likely that you'll have 4 pieces left over as the Japanese. In other words, you'll have your air units and most likely an infantry and artillery unit. If you have 1 or 2 more or less than that, then you were very lucky or very unlucky. The attack against the British battleship, this attack right here, 2 bombers and 1 cruiser, have a 67% chance of destroying the British battleship on the first round of combat. There is a very high probability that you're going to exchange this battleship for this cruiser. For my money, I carry the attack all the way through, and I believe in 2 of the 9 games I played, I lost a bomber as well as the cruiser. But it mattered not at all in the outcome. When it comes to Quangtong, this does seem like overkill, and I'll admit it is, but there's really not much else for most of these air units to do but hit Quangtong. This is also the territory that we're hitting with the least amount of land units, so if the British roll hot, they could wipe out the attacking amphibious force. There is in fact an 11.11% chance that the British knock out 2 pieces before going down. So 1 in 10 games, that can happen. And yes, I had that happen in one of my games. This to me is the most irritating thing, and you'll see why when it comes to the J2 purchase. I'll just cut to the chase and say that every single IPC you pick up is important to combine with the IPCs we saved from this turn, but we'll get to that in a moment. So probably the last point of interest here is what the Americans decide to do with this fighter. They could scramble it or they could keep it in the Philippines. Now, it's doomed either way, so it doesn't really matter what the Americans decide to do, but for my money, I would keep it in the Philippines. And that's because if there is the smallest chink in this J1 attack, it's the fact that there aren't a whole lot of ground units for the Japanese. There's plenty to do the job, but if you can stack up enough hits, it can make the Japanese uncomfortable. So again, if I were the American player, I would just leave it there. Okay, I'm now going to go ahead and execute the most highly likely outcome of events and casualties with regards to this J1, and wherever there's a coin to flip, I'm going to be generous to the Allies. First, this Quangtong garrison is going to go down, and there's a roughly 50% chance that they knock out an infantry on the return fire, so we'll give it to them. And that's more or less true for Yunnan as well. We're going to knock out both these Chinese infantry, and we'll go ahead and give them a casualty in return. And Yunnan will be kind to them as well. Normally you're going to have 2 ground units left, but it's not uncommon to have just the Japanese artillery. And in this spirit of generosity, we're going to say the C-Zone 37 battle went about as bad as it could for the Japanese, and we'll take 2 losses here. So we'll just minus out 1 Japanese bomber, 1 Japanese cruiser, but we're also going to take down the British battleship. In the Philippines, we're going to say the Americans did not scramble, and the most likely outcome is that they lose 2 infantry. But you know what? We're going to be generous here too and say they got lucky and snapped up a 3rd one. So they're just left with the Japanese armor. Finally, we're just going to wipe out the Asiatic fleet here in C-Zone 35. And just for completeness, we're going to be generous there and say that the Americans scored 1 hit and put it on the battleship. This does not matter at all. This damage marker will come off on the next turn because the Philippines has a naval base. So here we are at the end of the combat. We're now going to go into the non-combat move. All right, so we begin the non-combat movement phase, and virtually every air unit has 1 movement point left over, except for this bomber down here, right? So the first thing we have to do is pretty automatic. We've got to get all 3 carriers down here to C-Zone 35. That's 2 from C-Zone 6 up near Japan, and 1 from C-Zone 33. And all the planes are going to have to land on these 3 carriers. So we look like this when all is said and done down in the Philippines. Next, we're going to consolidate the entire Japanese Air Force here in Quangsi. So the Japanese bomber comes up from C-Zone 37 into C-Zone 36 and lands in Quangsi. And then, of course, so do all these air units adjacent to that territory. And, of course, I'm going to chip that. So we have 6 tactical bombers, 6 fighters, and 1 bomber in Quangsi at the end of J1 here. The fighter in Korea is going to move to Japan, and I'll explain why in a moment. Okay, we're going to go top to bottom here. Starting in Jehol, we're going to move the infantry into Chahar and the artillery into AnA. So we'll look like this. And then everything in Shantung and Gyeongsu moves to AnA as well. So we look like that. And finally, we'll move the infantry in Siam into French Indo. Next, we're going to bring this destroyer in C-Zone 33 up to C-Zone 6. And last but not least, these units here are going to push forward. So the mechanized infantry will move from Manchuria to AnA. Everything in Manchuria will move to Jehol. And all the Korean infantry will move to Manchuria. Now, if the Russians are still present north of your position, you'll want to leave 1 infantry in Korea and push the rest up. So at the end of the non-combat movement phase, we look like this. I'm going to go ahead and place the 3 transport build, and then we'll briefly discuss a couple of points. First, let's just recognize that the Japanese will collect 37 IPCs at the end of this round. And when we add it to the 5 IPCs that we saved from the beginning, we have 42. And 42 is the exact amount needed to purchase a minor industrial complex, an air base, and a naval base at the top of J2. More on that in a moment, but first let's take a look at what the Allies can do in terms of counterattacks or doing something to slow down the Japanese, and there's really almost nothing that they can do. Yes, they can retake Yunnan. The British can do this, or the Chinese can do this, and that's fine, but that is sort of the point. The more units the Allies stuff here, the happier the Japanese player should be, because right here we have 5 ground units. You might have more that survived. Either way, this Japanese Air Force is just this overpowering death ray, and it's worth the loss of 1 or 2 or even more of your air units to crush this Allied force here if they decide to fight there. If they don't and they turn tail and run, well, that's fine too. That means the Chinese won't get the bonus for the Burma Road being open. Doesn't really matter. The point is, if I'm the Japanese player, I'm totally comfortable with this situation. Do the British or the Anzacs have any counterattack options using their navies? Yeah, they do. And I've seen a couple of cute little tricks, but there's nothing that's going to stop what's going to happen. Yes, I've seen the Anzacs come up and around and do the whole Dutch New Guinea invasion and pick up their national objective. Japan just has to shoulder shrug and move on. All right, so what about the Americans? What options do they have now that we're all at war? And the answer is not very much. The attack into the Marshall Islands is essentially a non-starter. There's not a whole lot of attack strength to do it, and they are put in a position where they'll be immediately destroyed on a counterattack. There is an option to go straight for Tokyo up here. They can do this with a cruiser, a destroyer, a submarine, and both of these fighters on the Hawaiian Islands. And the way they would get away with those fighters is 1, 2, 3, 4. The fighters have 1 movement point left over, and then they would land on a carrier in Sea Zone 7. And that carrier comes from the west coast of the United States at 1, 2, 3. So you wouldn't have to move this carrier to Sea Zone 7. It just has to be demonstrated that that's their landing spot. So this attack actually has a 6% chance of success with the pieces that we have set up here. This is a very low probability event. I doubt many players would even attempt it. But even if an American player did do something this bold, don't forget that as the Japanese player, you have Kamikaze Tokens. These can be used in every territory where there's a Kamikaze symbol. And this is a critical rule. The most devastating aspect about the Kamikazes is the threat of their use. In other words, anytime the Americans are planning or theorizing about an attack into any of these sea zones with those symbols, they really do have to take into account that the Japanese might use 0, 1, or all of those tokens. Their ability to target specific ships is also quite devastating. So in this situation, even the boldest player should shy away from this low odds probability event because of the Kamikaze. This rule will become much more critical towards the mid-game, but I just want to plant that flag right now. But if that still causes some players to wince, then I'll just say that you can always plug the hole. You can send a Japanese destroyer into Sea Zone 16 or Sea Zone 25 and prevent these boats from ever coming into the sea zone at all, thus diffusing the attack completely. I would advise not doing this because if you want to get into a blocker trading war, you want the Americans to start it first. Because don't forget, the American player can hit the Japanese at 3 spaces, but the Japanese can hit right back, and the Americans are going to be very defensive-minded, especially when it comes to the Hawaiian Islands. And finally, we get to the Russians, and 8 out of the 9 games I played, I saw this happen. Just keep in mind that the Russians go first. They have to show you their hand before the Japanese player has to show their hand to the Russians. In the one game where I didn't see this happen, I believe my opponent left something like 6 infantry here, and so I just left a blocker in Korea. There's enough naval and transport capabilities to deal with any threat that comes to Korea. And those infantry were sorely missed in the defense of Moscow. Sorry, one quick final note about Russia. Don't forget that the Mongolia rule really incentivizes the Russians not to attack Manchuria or any territory adjacent to Mongolia for that matter. If they do so, they will lose access to these 6 pieces for the duration of the game. Before we move to Japan's second turn, I'm going to go ahead and move the Allied pieces. And what I've decided to do for this demonstration is to use a script from one of the better players that I played against in the tournament and use his exact moves from our game as a template. I just want to ram this point home. Every player is going to play a little bit differently, but what I'm going to do now is a fairly common response that I witnessed in the tournament. So first, for China, there was a counterattack from Sichuan into Yunnan. This attack was done with 2 infantry and 1 fighter. So for purposes of this demonstration, we're going to go ahead and give that to the Chinese. In their non-combat movement phase, they fell back and consolidated into Shenxi. 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So it was something like that. The British fell back onto India, and the British fleet fell back to help out in the war in Africa. In this game, the Americans went ahead and pushed all of their assets into the Hawaiian Islands. So we look something like this going into J2. Now I didn't place any units for the Allied players. It's not important. I'm gonna demonstrate the J2 from Japan's side, and then we're just gonna project J3 and onwards. So coming into J2, ideally you'll have 42 IPCs to spend because you'll want to buy one industrial complex, one air base, and one naval base as mentioned earlier. With the purchase complete, let's not forget to remove the damage token from our battleship around the Philippines here. And now we're ready for the combat move. But before I get to pushing any pieces, let's just take a quick moment and appreciate the position that the Philippines gives us as the Japanese on J2. Thanks to the naval base, this fleet now has access to Sea Zone 38, 41, 57, 56, and everywhere behind that line. And this position here is going to be critical to defending against the Americans in the mid and late game. So our first combat moves will be in China, and even if the Chinese left blockers, I really wouldn't change anything here. We're going to move one infantry from Shahar to Hopei. We're going to move one infantry from Anhui to Kwaichao. We're going to move an arty and the infantry from Hunan to Yunnan. We're going to move one infantry from French Indochina to Shan State. Then we're going to take the 6 fighters and 6 tactical bombers and smash Yunnan. For this turn, they've really got nothing better to do. We're going to take the bomber from Quangxi and hit Malaya. That's 1, 2, 3. And I'll just take a quick pause here before continuing and say the major goal of J2 is to snatch up Borneo and Malaya and Shan State if there's no British blocker here. We don't want to expose our infantry to destruction, so if they left a blocker in Burma, we're not going to take Shan State. But the main thing is to take British IPCs away from the UK in the Pacific. Securing the rest of these islands or messing around with the Australians, that's a J3 thing and onward. Next, we're going to move one transport from the sea zone around the Philippines and move him to Palau. Here he's going to pick up the infantry, obviously, and then move to Borneo. He can do this again because of that naval base. 1, 2, 3, takes Borneo. Next, we'll load this Quangtong infantry onto the transport, move him into the Philippines sea zone, load up the armor, move him into Sea Zone 36, and then finally move him into Sea Zone 37 where he will offload. I'm actually going to go ahead and take back one move here. This is more needed for a full transport load because I'm going to move this last transport from the Philippines here to pick these 2 pieces up and move them down here. So we have 4 land units, amphibious assaulting in Malaya. 1 armor, 3 infantry, and a bomber so far. Let's go ahead and move the battleship in to provide an offshore, and we'll throw in a tactical bomber for good measure. 1, 2, 3. So the only way this is legal is to commit a carrier to Sea Zone 37 in a non-combat move. But this battle's now riding at a 98% even with the aerial retreat. There's a high likelihood the Japanese will lose 2 pieces, and that's fine. Again, the primary goal on J2 is to capture Borneo and Malaya. If you do nothing else but those 2 things, you've done good enough. If you can cut the Burma Road like we're doing here, that's great. I'll say a few more things about Allied responses towards the end of this video. Okay, so the combat phase should be pretty quick. In this battle, we'll likely wipe out all 4 infantry and lose 2 on the return fire. That is the most probable outcome. And up here, of course, the Chinese will lose both of these pieces, and we'll say they take 1 down with them. So they're doing quite well, the Chinese are. And now we're going to move to the non-combat movement for Japan's turn 2, and this is extremely important for setting up turn 3. Just for completeness, we're going to say that we threw a fighter in on this attack as well. Might as well have, right? Because if we have a tactical bomber that needs a carrier to land here, might as well throw a fighter in there as well. So first move, let's go ahead and take this bomber back. We're going to land in French Indochina. Next, these 6 tactical bombers and 6 fighters will move to French Indochina. We'll go ahead now and move this carrier down here to Sea Zone 37 to catch our tactical bomber and fighter. Next, we'll move these carriers and a destroyer to Sea Zone 33 around the Caroline Islands. We'll move a sub there as well. We'll go ahead and move this destroyer from 35 to 37. We'll take this fighter now and move it down to French Indochina. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, next, the army in Anhui will move to Kwaichao. The army in Johor will move to Anhui, and the army in Manch will move to Johor. We'll move the submarine from Sea Zone 6 to Sea Zone 33. And heck, we'll move this battleship cruiser and one of those destroyers down there as well. So we've got quite the fleet built up in the Carolines to spar off with the American fleet here. And given this setup, we're going to go ahead and use this destroyer here as a blocker in C-Zone 16. Last, and perhaps most important, we'll load up 2 destroyers and 4 infantry onto these transports, bring them down to C-Zone 36 and offload them into French Indochina. Okay, with the non-combat movement phase complete, we will go ahead and place our builds. We'll put an air base in French Indochina, a naval base on the island of Hainan, and 1 minor industry in French Indochina. So when Japan gets to its collect income phase on J2, it should be collecting 47 IPCs. What we're going to do now is review our position here at the end of Japan's turn 2. We're going to project into turn 3 and then go over mid and long-term goals. I'm also going to cover some of the pressure points as Japan. This position might look a little bit crazy. You've got an American fleet here with only a single destroyer standing in the way of a very weak Tokyo. But in point of fact, the Americans cannot threaten an invasion. This is a blocker. If the Americans decide to remove this blocker or move their fleet into C-Zone 7 or C-Zone 16, this Japanese fleet can react. It can move 3 spaces up into C-Zone 6 or 16 while still maintaining pressure on the Hawaiian Islands. This position is helpful because it also maintains a ton of pressure on the southern end of the board. And an ongoing theme as Japan, going forward from the end of J2 onward, is to keep the Americans at arm's length. And the best way to do that is to understand that between Japan, the Philippines, and the Caroline Islands, there is a sort of defensive triangle. Japan can send units to the Caroline Islands and vice versa. Any naval units located in the Philippines can project in Japan as well as the Caroline Islands. The Philippines is also crucial because it helps project power into the west side of the board. They can go all the way to C-Zone 38. And manipulating the board in this way, all you're really doing is protecting your base and threatening the Hawaiian Islands. The Japanese shouldn't have plans to attack the Hawaiian Islands, or even Australia for that matter, so early in the game. The focus needs to be over here, where we will push into India and then past it and through it and continue in that direction until the Allies give up. And the best way to keep the Americans out of the war is understanding this position here. I'll say a few more things about defending against the Americans in a moment. Let's go ahead now and talk about French Indochina. With an industrial complex here and the air base, we now have an incredible amount of power projection into all areas of the board that matter. From French Indochina, we can easily hit India, going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and landing in Yunnan, or landing on carriers out in C-Zone 39, or if we controlled Shan State, we could land there as well. We can make it all the way back to Tokyo if needs be. There's almost an endless amount of examples of power projection here. I'll just provide one more example. Let's say the Americans knock down this blocker and push their whole fleet into C-Zone 6, thinking, you know, hey, I'm gonna disrupt his convoy, and then on the following turn I'll invade Korea or Japan or whatever, make him build units in Japan. Well, not so fast. All the air units here can go 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right, and land on Japan because of that air base. The American fleet wouldn't even be safe in C-Zone 16 in this example, right, because these air units can go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and land on carriers that are brought up from the Caroline Islands. And there's very, very little the American player can do to prevent any of that from happening. It's merely a matter of setting up the infrastructure. Because of this port, we have power projection with naval units and land units as well, right? Because now these 3 transports can bring their cargo 1, 2, 3 straight into India. So starting at the top of J3, the British have to worry about losing Calcutta. The goal of the Japanese player in China is to sort of push in and south at the same time. The different opponents of mine did different things with China. Some attacked, some ran into the Kansu corner and held up there. It really didn't matter. We're going to take our time and leisurely gobble up all of these territories in China while generally heading south towards Burma and then eventually crushing Calcutta. So those are some of the mid and long-term projections, but the J3, one of the main things you need to do on J3, if you do nothing else, make sure you knock out Sumatra, Java, and the Celebes. You need this for the IPCs, you also need this for your national objective, and it's really at the end of J3 that you see the true power of this J1 attack strategy. It really shows itself in the amount of money that you collect at the end of J3. Japan will collect something like 68 or 69 IPCs at the end of its 3rd turn, while the United States is picking up something like 75 each turn. The Japanese will want to churn out at least 3 infantry per turn here in French Indochina. You eventually want to get a second minor industrial complex set up here in Quangtong and produce mechanized infantry so that they can assist in the attack on Calcutta. One other option the Japanese player has is to station submarines or naval units of some kind in Sea Zone 39. This will very quickly bring India to its knees. Most of the time it's not able to make enough money to produce any more units at all after the third turn. And at that point you can essentially match the American purchase in the Pacific turn for turn, causing an endless stalemate at best for the Americans over here, while you continue to hammer and push west into the Middle East and into Russia. Remember that this Mongolia rule really only affects territories adjacent to Mongolia. Eventually, as Japan, you'll want to take Soviet Far East, Siberia, and Sakha, and the territories that are not here on my map because I didn't link up the Europe map to it, but there's Novosibirsk and a few other territories you can take without having to activate the Mongolia rule. You'll still be at war with Russia, but they won't get these 6 infantry pieces and you won't have to deal with Russian units running around back here. So before I recap this video and close, I want to go over a couple of the Allied responses that I saw that were fairly unique in my tournament. One of the things I saw an opponent do that I thought was at least interesting was pick up 2 units into this transport and move it by itself over to Sea Zone 36, offloading it here in French Indochina. Obviously the Japanese cruiser wasn't here to stop it, or else he couldn't have done that. And in combination with the British Air Force, it eliminated the 2 infantry on French Indochina, converting this territory temporarily into a British one and preventing me from building my air base and my industrial complex on J2. In that case, as the Japanese, I recommend just building this naval base, of course, and some destroyers and submarines and whatever else you feel you might need, and adding these units in on the following turn. Again, we've got overwhelming strength coming down. We're going to retake French Indochina and push the British back. Eventually, they're not going to be able to hold here, so that was cute, but didn't stop or slow really anything. Another move I saw that happened in nearly every single game was AnZac moving out and taking either Dutch New Guinea or one of these money islands. Now this move is hard for me to understand. If the Australian player decides to move into Dutch New Guinea and drop off an infantry and take the territory for Australia, yes, he gets 5 IPCs the turn he does that, but whatever boats were sent up here to do that are going to be wiped out by the Japanese. And even if it's just the transport that ends up getting wiped out, taking Dutch New Guinea, you've lost 7 IPCs to gain 5. And even if the Japanese don't take it back for 2 or 3 turns, I'm not sure that that cost was worth the gain. Your mobility killing this infantry, this was 7 IPCs, that's a loss of at least 10 right there, so that would take at least 2 turns to get your money back, not even to gain anything, and you've removed pieces from the board at a vital moment in the game. So I can safely say as a Japanese player, whenever I saw any move by the British or the Anzacs or even the Chinese to do something cute like this, it really didn't matter at all. It really was about as annoying as a mosquito would be to a charging elephant. Okay, the time has finally come to recap this rather lengthy video. This video is, or at least is, an attempt to provide a script for the J1 attack. I then demonstrated the J1, which is a script I followed almost to a T in every single one of my games. The J2 I demonstrated as well, slightly different based on what the Allied players did, but the goals were the same. J2, it should be a focus on Malaya and Borneo, and J3 it should be a focus on Sumatra, Java, and the Celebes. Beyond J3, you should be crushing Calcutta, and you should do this all at your leisure. Don't feel like you are rushed. There are plenty of naval assets to suffocate India and prevent them from gaining their IPCs via this convoy route. China is so hindered and hamstrung that they can be crushed at your leisure as well. And if you understand this dynamic in the Pacific, it is fairly easy to match purchases with the United States and force a draw in this area of the board until the Japanese overrun not only India, but the Middle East as well. By turn 7, 8, and 9, the Axis should have the balance of the board economy. Before I close, I'll pay a very small amount of lip service to the Europe side of the board. As Germany, I'm not seeking a grand battle in Moscow. I attack Russia on turn 2, and I move towards their capital, but I never actually want to engage in a pitched fight there because you might lose that fight, right? I don't want to lose all those assets. I just want the Russian army to stay in Moscow while the Japanese corner the world economy by punching through into the Middle East. The Europe side of the board may deserve its own video in the future with regards to this strategy, but what made mincemeat out of the Allies was Japan. Whereas Germany and Italy could be slowed or even stopped, Japan seemed to steamroll everyone, and it seemed that this J1 attack was the overpowering element that caused it. Okay, this concludes my video on the J1 attack in Global 1940s 2nd edition. Let me know what you think about the J1 in the comment section below. Please share your experiences, and if you think you have something that would stop or just slow the J1 and make it less devastating, do let me know in the comment section below. Thank you for watching this. All the best from the good captain, and bye-bye.